All right, welcome back. So we're looking here at the male secondary sex characteristics. So other than the effect of the androgens on the testes to produce sperms, also the androgen going to be responsible for the appearance of the secondary sexual characteristics for male, like the appearance of the pubic and facial hair, deepening of the voice, thickening of the skin, and the skin becomes oily, enhances bone growth and increase its density. Skeletal muscle will also increase in size and mass. So those are the secondary sexual characteristics for the presence of the male sex hormone. Moving on to the structure of the female reproductive system. Looking here first at the primary sex organ, which is the ovary, as you see on here. The ovary is going to be responsible for the formation of the eggs, the ovum. And the ovum is going to be picked up by those finger-like projections of the fallopian tube. We call those finger-like projections are the fimbriae. The fimbriae will be conducting the ovulated egg to the proximal, the most distal part of the fallopian tube, which is going to be the infundibulum. Then this ovulated egg is going to be passing through a bulging part of the fallopian tube or the uterine tube, because this is the ampulla of the fallopian tube. This bulging segment, it's going to be much better when we look on here. So we've got the fimbriae, those finger-like projections. The entrance of the fallopian tube is the infundibulum, and this bulging part of the fallopian tube on here is the ampulla of the fallopian tube. The fallopian tube will join the endometrial cavity, and if you see on here, this is going to be the uterus. The uterus has a muscle layer in the middle, covered from outside by the perimetrium, and the muscle layer here is the myometrium. And to the inside, the uterus is going to be lined by a mucosal lining. We call this mucosal lining of the uterus, it's the endometrium. Endometrium. We can see the fundus of the uterus on here. This dome-shaped part of the uterus is called the fundus of the uterus. And the uterus is going to be attached forward to the anterior wall of the abdominopelvic cavity by a ligament. We call this ligament is the round ligament. We can see also another ligament that attaches the uterus posteriorly to the sacrum. We call this as a uterosacral ligament. Uterosacral ligament is simply attaching the uterus to the sacrum on here, forming the lower part of the vertebral column. We can see on here the part of the uterus that will be passing down to the inside of the vaginal canal. This is the vagina. And we can see part of the uterus is traveling down in the vaginal canal. We call this as the cervix. This part of the uterus that travels down in the vaginal canal, this is what we call the cervix. We can see that the cervix is surrounded by a shallow space inside the vaginal canal. We call this as the fornix. So we have the anterior fornix, posterior fornix, and on both sides of the cervix on here, from an anterior view, we can see the lateral fornices. So again, if we're looking at the part of the uterus traveling down in the vaginal canal, we call this as the cervix. It's going to be surrounded by anteriorly the anterior fornix, posteriorly the posterior fornix, and on both sides we're going to have this space. It's called the lateral fornix. The vaginal canal is going to be opening to the outside. The outside opening of the vaginal canal is going to be covered by a mucous membrane. We call this as the hymen. If you notice the vaginal opening, it's going to be located posterior to the external urethral orifice, which is the opening of the urethra. And the external urethral orifice on here is located posterior to the clitoris, which is the erectile tube that corresponds to the male penis. Posterior to the vaginal opening and the hymen, we're going to see the Bartholin's gland, the gland which is going to be responsible for the secretion of the mucus that will be lubricating the vagina and facilitates the intercourse. Posterior to the Bartholin's gland, we can see the opening of the anal canal or the anus. And the anal canal here, it's the continuation of the rectum, which is the straight part of the colon. Bounding from both sides, the Bartholin's gland, the opening of the vagina, the external urethral orifice, and the clitoris, we've got two lips. A lip on the inside, it's formed by mucous membranes. It's called the labium minorum or labium minus. And the skin fold surrounding it from outside, it's called the labium majus or labia majora. So again, what we've seen so far, we've seen the ovary, we've seen the fimbriae, which are the finger-like projections that will be picking up the ovulated egg. We've seen the entrance of the fallopian or the uterine tubes. This is the infundibulum. We've seen the bulging part of the uterine tubes. This is called the ampulla. We've seen 3 layers of the uterus from outside in. We've got the layer covering the outside of the uterus, surrounding the uterus from outside. It's my perimetrium. Peri means around, and metrio means uterus. So we've got the perimetrium on the outside. Then we've got the muscle layer, myometrium. And lining the inside, we've got the mucosal lining of the uterus. This is the endometrium. If you remember, endo means inside, and inside the uterus, endometrium. We've seen the part of the uterus that will be traveling down to the inside of the vaginal canal, the proximal part of the vaginal canal. This is called the cervix. It's surrounded anteriorly by the anterior fornix, posteriorly by the posterior fornix, and on both sides by the lateral fornices. The vaginal opening is covered with the mucous membrane down here that we call the hymen. Anterior to the vaginal opening, we've got the external opening of the urethra. We call this is my external urethral opening. Anterior to the external urethral opening, we've got the erectile tissue tube. that corresponds to the male penis, it's the clitoris. Located posterior to the vaginal opening, we've got the gland on here that will be releasing the mucus that helps with the lubrication of the vagina. This is the Bartholin's gland. Another name that we use for the Bartholin's gland, it's the greater vestibular gland. Bartholin's gland or the greater vestibular gland. Posterior to the Bartholin's gland, you can see the opening of the anal canal, the anus, anal canal, and posterior to the uterus and the vagina, we can see here the rectum. Bounding the Bartholin's gland, opening of the vagina, and the external urethral orifice, as well as the clitoris. From both sides, we've got two lips, got the labium minus or labia minora, and the skin fold on here, it's the labia majora or labium majus. Looking on here, at first the parts of the fallopian or uterine tube, we've got the fimbriae, which will be picking up the ovulated egg. The most distal part that serves as the entrance of the uterine tube, it's the infundibulum. And the bulging part here of the fallopian or uterine tube, it's called the ampulla. The uterine tube, it's connected to the endometrial cavity with this constricted portion of the uterine tube. It's called the isthmus. Looking at the different parts of the uterus, if you see on here, we've got the dome-shaped part of the uterus. This is called the fundus. The mid-region of the uterus is the body of the uterus. And the most distal part of the uterus that will be traveling to the inside of the vaginal canal, this is what we call the cervix. So if we wanted to divide the uterus into three main parts, the dome-shaped part is called the fundus, the middle region is called the body of the uterus, and the most distal region that passes to the vaginal canal, it's called the cervix. Looking at the different parts of the cervix, we can see an internal opening that connects the cervix to the endometrial cavity, and an external opening that connects the cervix to the vaginal canal. And we've got a tiny canal that connects both openings to one another. So we call the internal opening, it's the internal os. External opening here that connects the cervix to the vagina, it's the external os. And the canal that serves as a connection between the internal os and the external os, it's what we call the cervical canal. If we're looking at a cut section in the wall of the uterus, we can see an outer covering of the uterus is what we call the perimetrium. Again, peri, around, and metrio is the uterus. Deeper to the perimetrium, we've got this thick muscle layer, which we call the myometrium, myo muscle, and metrio, again, it's the uterus. To the inside of the myometrium, we've got the internal lining. We call the internal lining of the uterus, it's the endometrium. Looking at a very large and flattened ligament that will be surrounding the fallopian tube. the ovary, and the uterus. We call this is my broad ligament. Broad ligament, it's a sheet-like ligament that will be covering the fallopian tube, the ovary, and the uterus, and helps to stabilize all the female reproductive organs in their place inside the pelvic cavity. We call the part of the broad ligament that will be surrounding the fallopian tube, it's the mesosalpinx. Salpingo here, salpinx means something related to the fallopian or uterine tube. We've got the part of the broad ligament that will be covering the ovary. We call this as the mesovarium. Ovarium means related to the ovary. And we've got the part of the broad ligament that will be surrounding the uterus. It's called mesometrium. Again, metrio means related to the uterus. So again, what we're looking at here, we're looking at a flattened ligament that will be surrounding the uterine tube, the ovary, and the uterus. We call this is the broad ligament. Part of the broad ligament that surrounds the fallopian tube, we call this is the mesosalpinx. The part that will be surrounding the ovary is the mesovarium, and the part that surrounds the uterus is called the mesometrium. We can see also here another ligament that will be attaching the ovary, just the ovary here. It's the ovarian ligament. And we can see from this view also a ligament that we've seen in the previous diagram. It's called the round ligament. If you remember, the round ligament is the ligament that will be attaching the uterus forward to the anterior abdominal pelvic wall. You can see on here attaching the cervix to the lateral walls of the pelvic cavity. This is what we call the lateral cervical ligament or the cardinal ligament. And you can see on here the ligament that was attaching the uterus posteriorly to the sacrum. It's called the uterosacral ligament. This is what we've seen in the previous diagram on here. This is the uterosacral ligament on here. And this is from the anterior view. Many get confused between the uterosacral ligament, which is this rounded ligament on here, and the lateral cervical ligament, which is the flattened part down here. All right, so please make sure you can differentiate between the uterosacral ligament and the cardinal or the lateral cervical ligament. Questions? All right, so far we have completed many of the most important diagrams for the upcoming lab exam. Our last lab exam actually. So we've got 3 5-stars diagrams for the male reproductive system. So a sagittal section of the male pelvis showing the male reproductive organs. This is a 5-stars diagram. The sagittal section of the testis on here is also a 5-stars diagram showing the different ducts through which the sperm is going to be conducted. And the third 5-stars diagram in the male reproductive system is this going to be the anterior superior view of the penis, as well as the transverse section of the penis and the connection between the penis and the other parts of the male reproductive system. We've covered two of the most important diagrams in this chapter, also in the female reproductive system. The sagittal section of the female pelvis showing the female reproductive organs and their associated organs and the relationship between the uterus, vagina, and the rectum posteriorly, and the urinary bladder and the urethra anteriorly. Another 5 stars diagram is going to be his diagram showing an anterior view of the female reproductive organs. All the markings on those diagrams are highly important and they are testable. All right, so it's very important whenever you get a chance, try to do this as early as possible, because we're going to have a bunch of other diagrams coming up with the digestive system. So please make sure to get this part done as early as possible to not be rushed towards the due date for the lab exam. All right, so this completes our discussion for today. Thank you so much for making it to the meeting today. Next class, we're going to be discussing the female reproductive system physiology, which is going to be consisting of the large essay question that we're going to have in the upcoming lab exam. All right, so it's very, very important. It's very important for you to make sure to attend next class. No in-class activity or no in-class activity questions for today's session. Any questions you want to ask about the upcoming exam covering